Hello students, welcome to part 3 of the meetings lecture series. In part 3, you're going to learn how to facilitate meetings. So in part 1, you learned some basic planning things that you have to take into account when planning the meeting. Part 2, you learned how to write an agenda for a meeting because the agenda is going to be the lifeblood and your best friend when it comes to actually facilitating the meeting. And now we're talking about actual meeting facilitation. So there are a couple of things on the agenda for this part. First, we're going to talk about opening the meeting. Then we're going to talk about facilitating the meeting. So how to get the meeting started, and then facilitating is actually running the meeting itself. And that's pretty much it for this part. Now, when you're opening the meeting, there's a couple of things that you need to take into account, a couple of principles. First, you always want to start on time. One of the biggest things that you have to keep in mind when you are the leader of a meeting is that you are indeed the leader and that you lead by examples. So what that comes with is, number one, I would always arrive early before everyone else does. So give yourself like 10 to 15 minutes just to get set up, just to get acquainted with the room, and to also ensure that you have all the technology that you need and everything works. So usually 10 to 15 minutes is what I recommend, but it could be more if you have complex things going on in the meeting room or on the platform. But the start on time note also speaks to people arriving late. So if your agenda says you start at 9 a.m., start at 9 a.m. Even if you're missing some people, still start at 9 a.m. Because the people who do show up on time, you have to respect their time. And the people who do follow the agenda and do manage their time properly, you need to respect those people. If you try to wait for other people to show up, well, we'll wait 5 minutes, we'll delay 5 minutes because Mark isn't here, all that. First off, you're losing time on your agenda. Secondly, you're sending a message to all the people that it's okay to show up late because you'll wait for them. And you don't want to set that precedent. So always start on time, regardless of who's there and who's not. Now, if the person that's missing is really important, that's okay. You can reconfigure the agenda to work on the items that you need to work on. And then when that person finally shows up, if they show up, then you can work them into the schedule. But then secondly, you want to give a welcome statement. Now, the welcome statement is essentially like a welcome to the meeting, here's the purpose type welcome statement. You just want to open up with, welcome, I'm glad that you all are here. You know, I called this meeting today because, and then give the general purpose of why you're having this meeting, kind of like a review of the overview of the agenda. Now, some people, when they run meetings, they like to do icebreakers as well. This is your call. If you're meeting with a group who hasn't met before, like this is the first time people are meeting, then yeah, you probably want to do an icebreaker where people self-identify who they are and what their role is, and that way everyone can kind of get an idea of who is who. Now, if you're doing a meeting where everybody already knows each other, some people still like to do icebreakers just to get people used to talking and getting them warmed up. Especially if I do a virtual meeting, I still like to do some kind of quick icebreaker, so that way we can ensure everybody's mic works and everybody, knows video works and everybody knows how to use the platform. So an icebreaker for non-acquainted people will of course be like your name, your position, and maybe something you want to get accomplished. If you're already acquainted, then you can do something like your favorite hobby or something that will get people relaxed but also talking. And then lastly, after you've done the icebreaker, you want to preview the agenda. When you preview the agenda, you're just going to give people a quick walkthrough of what's going to be happening in this meeting today and the time allotments that you have. So you'll just kind of give them an overview of the items you're going to cover. Now, if you have spare time allotted, you can also ask people if there's any other items that have came up or other concerns that they want to bring up in the meeting. And then in that additional time that you've allotted, you could potentially write those in to the agenda. And if you have time to get to them, great. But if you don't, at least you'll have those for the next meeting. Now, when you actually facilitate the meeting, there's a couple things that you want to keep in mind. The first thing when you facilitate the meeting, probably the biggest principle, is stick to the agenda. Don't try to go off the agenda and say, oh, well, this is 12:10 to 12:20. No, let's do this, and then let things get off topic. So you have the introduction from 12 to 12:10. Okay, great. Now 12:10 to 12:20, we're talking about previous committee business. So keep it to that. Don't try to make changes suddenly after you've committed to the agenda that you've previewed. So stick to the agenda. If something is not related to previous committee business, you can table it and you can say, that's a good thought. Let's stick to previous committee business for now, but let's table that for a little bit later down in the meeting in our additional time here. Okay? So you don't have to reject people, but just table their ideas and decide whether this is relevant to the task at hand, and the task at hand is whatever point you are in your agenda. Secondly, one thing you want to do as you facilitate a meeting is you want to enhance each member's contributions. So basically, you want each member who is there to feel like they are valued. Now, sometimes a member may make a comment or a suggestion or something that just is maybe a little bit off. So here's what you can do to ensure that each member's contribution and each member feels like they're valued regardless of their contribution. Number one, if their contribution is a little off, maybe just ask for clarification. Maybe ask someone, if somebody says something that's a little weird or just, I don't know, just it doesn't seem to fit what we're talking about, just ask them to clarify a little more. Okay, can you explain a little bit more? And then maybe as they explain, something will come out of it and you'll find value in that, and then it'll work out. And then you can also acknowledge merits. So find something good to say about every contribution if you can. And maybe if you don't agree with the whole idea, but maybe there's some premise to the idea that you really like. Or maybe you like the spirit behind the thinking behind the idea. Cool. Acknowledge that. And then thirdly, if somebody proposes an idea and you're just not sure if it's, a good idea, or you think that it's maybe just a little outside of what you're trying to do, just explain your concerns and just say, this might have some challenges, or this might have some barriers, or there might be some things that will make this idea hard to do. But the idea is that you want to critique the idea, not the person, is the idea. In fact, you want to praise the person. So you might say, I'm glad that you're really thinking of solutions, John. The thing about this idea is that it has a good idea, there's a good spirit behind it, but it's going to be hard to do this, or we don't have the money for that. But I like the thinking on that, something like that. And then fourthly, you can ask for improvement. So let's say somebody proposes an idea and it has some barriers. You don't have to leave it at that and say, well, the problem is that there's going to be a cost barrier and there's going to be, a resource barrier. You could then say, but with that in mind, does anybody here have an idea on how to work around those barriers? Or is there a way we can improve on this idea if you all think this is a great idea to do, even if we have those cost and resource barriers? What could we do to get around those? Okay, so now you're taking an idea, you've clarified it, you've acknowledged its merits, you maybe even explained your concerns, and then now you're giving it back to your participants to perhaps improve it and save it and maybe make it better. And then maybe that idea that first sounded kind of crazy or off-putting actually was a good idea with just a little bit of improvement. That's what you really want to do as a meeting facilitator, is to take everybody's contributions and figure out how to create value out of them, regardless of where they're coming from. And then you also want to think about how to generate discussion. So a lot of times when you're a meeting facilitator, you're not just going through officer reports and just saying, okay, treasurer, what's going on? And then John, what's going on? Like that. Status update meetings, you're going to be doing a lot of that. But when you're having to do problem solving or innovation meetings, you're going to need to be able to facilitate discussion and good discussion among your participants, because not everyone can talk at once, and you want to make sure that there's the free exchange of ideas. So there are 4 types of questions that you can use to create discussion as a facilitator. First, you have overhead questions. And these are questions that are directed to the whole group, and anyone is free to answer. So if I want to start a discussion, I might ask something like, what's the best event you've ever been to? And I say it to the whole group. And then I wait for somebody to answer. That's an overhead question, and anybody can pop in. That's an overhead question. Now, it's okay to do overhead questions, but if there's somebody who keeps raising their hand, or there's like a dominant figure, you want to make sure that you let other people get a chance to talk too. Secondly, there are direct questions, which are aimed at a specific individual. So let's say that I am running a meeting for event planning, and I want to know specifically the design color scheme for the invitations. I probably wouldn't make that an overhead question, because then not everyone knows the answer, but I would probably ask that question directly to the graphic designer. And I'll just say, hey, graphic designer, what are the color schemes for the invitations? Okay, so then graphic designer answers. It's a direct question. Now, what's nice about direct questions is because you isolate it to one person, you're likely going to get a very quick answer right away. But the problem is, if you do direct questions a lot, you don't want somebody to feel like they're being singled out or interrogated in front of people. So you just have to be careful with direct questions. Have overhead questions, of course, but then use direct questions too if you want to isolate an individual. Thirdly, you can do reverse questions. A reverse question is when somebody asks you a question and you answer it with a question. Pretty much the same question. So if somebody says, what should we do if we were to cancel the event? What do we do then? A reverse question would be taking that and saying, I don't know. What do you think we should do? I just reversed the question and had you answer it instead. So you give me the question and I reverse it and give it back to you. What do you think we should do? Okay, that's reverse. So that's a good way. Reverse questions are good if you don't want to give a direct answer because you don't want to poison the pool with your input. And also, reverse questions are good to use if you think the person is asking you a question and they already have an answer and they're more or less quizzing you. So if somebody's asking it with a kind of tone like they already have the answer or they already know the answer, use a reverse question. Oh, well, what do you think? What do you think we should do? And they'll probably already have an answer ready to go. Lastly, you have relay questions. Relay questions are where somebody asks you a question and then you relay it to the general audience. So it would be like as if you ask me a question and I say, I don't know, class, what do you think the answer is to that? You might notice I do that in study sessions. So relay questions are somebody asks you a question and you relay it to the general group. So you basically turn a direct question that is directed towards you into an overhead question that is directed to the audience. Lastly, let's talk about managing interactions. When you're leading discussion in a meeting and you're trying to get people to talk and you're trying to maximize contributions, there's two things that you can do that I think will help. Number one, you have to limit talkers and you have to encourage silent members. So if you have somebody who's just dominating all the conversation and constantly is raising their hand, that's good. You want to appreciate them because they're providing energy and synergy to the meeting and they're filling the room with ideas and sparking things. But at the same time, you want to make sure everybody else is getting a chance to get a word in. And sometimes when you have a dominant figure in a discussion, people don't even want to participate because they assume the dominant figure is just going to take over anyway. So you really don't want to do that. You don't really want the dominant figure taking over. So sometimes you can mute the dominant figure. I know like on Zoom you could hit the mute button, but like you probably just want to say something like when you ask your question, okay, I want to ask you all this. And those of you who've been participating quite a bit, let's hold off a second. Let's let some other people who haven't participated answer. And then give a moment for silent members to talk. And then of course you can always remind of time constraints. The thing is, discussions can go so many directions. If you study interpersonal communication, they're called topical pivots, where basically one topic relates to another, which relates to another. You start off talking about going to the grocery store, but through topical pivots, now you're talking about, your favorite movie, because just through pivots. So one way to keep people from pivoting is to remind of time constraints, come back to the agenda, and if you think things are getting off relevance, you have to be the referee to say, okay, let's bring it back to this topic. And then thirdly, once again, if somebody brings up an idea and it's really good, but it's just not relevant to the item at hand, table it. Tabling it doesn't mean reject it or, well, let's do that another time. Tabling it is, that's a really good idea. How about we talk about that towards the end of the meeting? I think that's a really good thing to talk about later. And then work with it that way. But you want to make sure that like when somebody has something like that, you want to write it down. Make sure your note taker is writing it down. So that way you can follow up on it at the next meeting. Now, in this section then, we talked about two things. We talked about opening and how to open the meeting, arriving early, welcome statement, icebreakers, all those things. And we talked about facilitating, how to manage discussion, how to keep people on time. Now, in the last part of this lecture series, we're going to talk about closing and follow-up, how to close the meeting and how to follow up to make sure everything gets done.